here's how I turned this boring old stickman into this. But let's start from the beginning. The first thing to do is create a project and make our player. So I drew this. Listen, it's not much, but it works for now. After dragging it into our scene, I added a rigid body and a collider to it. Now to make our player move around in the scene, I wrote a simple script and our player can move left, right and even jump. That's enough for now. But right now, our player is looking quite simple. So let's redesign him. After failing several times, I decided to borrow an image off Google, but I will redesign him in the future. Then I ripped his limbs apart and slowly twisted them until I got something that looked like a run. To improve this animation, I did some reading on walk cycles and practiced sketching characters for hours to create the most convincing and realistic run to fully immerse the player in. Okay, I'm done. Now that didn't take too long, so let's do it 30 more times. And that's the last animation done. Anyways, I added some lines of code and linked the animations to our player. And now our player is looking like a real spy and not just a stickman. What is a spy without its weapon? So it's time to give our player a gun. To make the gun, I'll just use this sprite and attach a transform at its barrel. And using this script, I'll spawn a bullet at that point, and that's pretty much our gun. But right now I can only shoot straight, so I need to change that. I like how Cuphead handles its aiming system, so I'll be taking inspiration from it and trying to make it work in our game. Now if I press a button, for example D, the player moves right. But if I have a weapon, the code should tell the player to use that animation instead of this one. And now if I hold W while pressing D, the code should think, what's between right and up? Top right, and it tells the player to aim in that direction. Repeat this for 8 different sides, and now we can use our gun. Now what's the point of a gun if there's nothing to shoot at? So I added Walmart Agent 47 as our enemy. Right now, the enemy is an absolute idiot and just stands there. Now to make him smart and actually move around, we need some AI. The AI will have 3 states: patrolling, following, and confusion. Getting him to patrol is easy enough. It just moves between 2 points, applying a positive and negative force on the enemy and flipping its sprite when it turns. And that's about it for patrolling. Now to get it to follow the player, I'm going to use something called the A-star pathfinding asset, which does all the complex vector nav mesh stuff, so idiots like me can make AI. Now for an AI to work, it needs a nav mesh. That is pretty much the area that's walkable by the AI. It uses it to know what is and isn't ground. Using this information, it can do some math to calculate a line, which is the fastest way to reach the target while following the marked terrain. Now with all this, all I need to do is make the enemy follow this line and jump at these angles. Now the problem with this is that the enemy is always aggressive. To make the enemy aggressive only when the player is in range, I'll use a raycast, which is an invisible line that collides with objects to see if a player is colliding with it or not. If it doesn't detect a player, the enemy is passive, but if it matches with a player, the enemy starts to pathfind and becomes aggressive. Now once the enemy is aggressive, it ditches the raycast and uses the box, ignoring all obstacles. And the only way to lose the enemy is to outrun that box. That is our following system done, and all that's left is confusion. But before we make it, we need to add a new gadget, the invisibility watch. As the name suggests, it's a watch that makes you invisible. Now to make the invisibility, I need to. After following some tutorials, I ended up with this. The way this works is I generate a noise map that increases and decreases its concentration with this number. The white is a desired texture and the black area is transparent. Now that is our sprite mask for the player, and it looks something like this. Now for the glow, I'll use the mask from before and highlight the black area. Then I'll subtract it from the white area by a bit, then I'll assign a different color to it and make that our base texture. Now with all this done, whenever I increase or decrease this value from 0 to 1, the player becomes visible and invisible with these highlights. Now that's well and good, but to finish off the player, I added another player underneath the player with this translucent texture, so when the player does go invisible, the user can still see the player and not just nothing. Now with that done, we can focus back onto our last state, confusion, which happens when a player goes invisible when the enemy is following him. Now if that happens, the enemy is supposed to start patrolling a small area around where the player went invisible. Now the issue with that is that the enemy doesn't know the terrain in that area, so it'll walk off an edge or keep ramming into a wall. To solve this problem, will use raycasts. All raycasts will do is check if there's a wall or a ledge, and if there is, it'll make the enemy turn around. After 10 seconds of searching, the enemy loses interest and stops searching. Now it's time to merge all three of these states together to get an enemy that's patrolling on a set path that follows the player once the player is in range, and then gets confused when the player goes invisible, only to return to its original patrol after 10 seconds. Now that's great, but the enemy isn't much of an enemy right now. So to make him an actual threat, we'll make it do damage to the player whenever it's close by. To make this, I'll set a player health and deduct points from it every time it collides with the enemy, and just apply some UI, and that's about it. Now with the enemy done, I started to work on a small map to showcase what the game is like right now. In this map, I'll have 3 interactable things: vents, ladders, and ropes. I don't know if you know this, but vents are not usually very big, so we need to be able to make our player crouch to fit into them. So I completely deleted my old player movement and started work on a new script. And after some time, our player can do whatever it did before and crouch. And since I planned ahead, I already have all of the animations done. The movement is better now, but it still lacks a lot of verticality. So I added the ability to climb ladders and did the same thing for ropes. But that's too simple, so why not overcomplicate it? So instead of doing whatever this is, the player can latch onto the rope by walking into it when it's in range, and then switch sides with A and D, and then dive off by clicking A and D again. Simple enough, right? The last mechanic I want to add is wall jumping. So I added it with these lines of code, and then tweaked the values to make the wall jump, then added this simple animation, and that's about it. Now, before I reveal the first prototype, if you are enjoying, drop a sub for part 2, it'd be much appreciated. Anyways, this is the prototype for our first game. That's all from me. Like if you like, dislike if you don't, and goodbye.